Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Maya Emerson, and I'm a member of the Educational Opportunities Project here at the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And it is my great pleasure to welcome each of you to our conversation today: racial equity in higher education, increasing BIPOC access and completion rates in Ohio and nationwide. And it's also my pleasure to thank you for joining us, and thank you for your commitment to racial equity as demonstrated by joining this conversation today. So feel very free to be interactive with our panelists today. Drop questions in the chat and we will circle back to them at the end during our Q&A session. Speaking of our panelists, we have some incredible speakers lined up for you this afternoon. And the first to kind of kick off our conversation is my colleague on the Lawyers Committee EOP team, Mr. Yvonne Noisette. So I will kick it off to him to kick off to start our conversation. So Ivan.
Thank you so much, Maya, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. So as many of you know, the National Lawyers Committee was founded in 1963 at the behest of the Kennedy administration to leverage the resources of the private bar on behalf of civil rights efforts around the country. And since that time, the Lawyers Committee has continued that work in a number of key areas, including voting rights, economic justice, criminal justice, digital justice, housing, and of course, education. The Education Opportunities Project team of the Lawyers Committee has been proactively engaged in fighting for greater racial equity in K through 12, as well as higher education. And over the past several years, we've sort of been defending the importance of diversity in higher education and removing barriers to access for students of color. Recently, we've sought to intervene in a few race-conscious admissions cases, including Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard, Students for Fair Admissions v. UNC, and Students for Fair Admissions v. UT. In all of those cases, students and alumni have highlighted that their universities should continue expanding their efforts to promote diversity on campus, and they've rejected sort of the faulty rationale of those seeking to undermine the importance of holistic admissions and racial diversity. We've also fought to ensure equitable funding for Maryland's HBCUs, and you can visit the Education Opportunities Project's webpage on the Lawyers Committee website if you'd like more information about all of these efforts and more. So in addition to defending race-conscious admissions, we have also wanted to reimagine how the civil rights community can approach higher education racial equity and sort of take advantage of the higher education racial equity advocacy energy in this current moment as the terrain sort of rapidly shifts. And the Reason Project, while we're here today, is one of those advocacy efforts that the Lawyers Committee is currently leading to help with this reimagining process in a few key areas. So the Reason Project aims to build more higher education racial equity for students of color, and it uses a framework that includes the following pillars: recruitment, a concept we call equity in practice, accountability, social inclusion, opportunity culture, and networks. So hence the acronym that we use, REASON. And we've built inclusive and multi-sector state-based coalitions to lead this project in the states of Illinois and Ohio. And today we're thrilled to sort of host this first webinar for the Ohio Coalition to sort of showcase all of the incredible work that they've been doing and host this conversation of this critically important issue. And our coalition, it includes civil rights leaders, education advocates, policy experts, business leaders, grassroots leaders, and so many more. And some examples include the NAACP Ohio, LULAC Ohio, the AAUP in Ohio, the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, student and alumni affinity groups, and so many more partners. So all of us collectively aim to improve access and graduation rates for students of color at the state flagship in Ohio and advance campus racial justice along all the pillars of the Reason framework that I mentioned a moment ago. And our coalition is developing a set of university level recommendations and proposals for how to expand access and increase completion rates, as well as create more inclusive learning spaces, both inside and outside of the classroom for students. We also work to generate promising and high impact state public policy ideas that can inform the agendas and priorities of advocates and state legislators. So all of us as a coalition, we understand that for years, some strategies to increase access to higher education for Black and Brown students have oftentimes fallen short. Sometimes they're generalized, they exclude key voices from the conversation. Oftentimes they lack coordination to be successful, thereby making them ineffective and creating this endless loop with slow progress. So this project aims to bring new stakeholders into this conversation. And all of these stakeholders have a genuine commitment to racial equity, and they bring fresh new perspectives. And we hope that this project will be able to identify where past efforts have fallen short and create meaningful alternatives for continued improvement for our Black and Brown students. The targeted audience for this project includes university leaders, state administrative offices, state legislative leaders, civil rights leaders, education advocates, and educators themselves. And we invite all of you to participate in this project to identify solutions that can occur at the universities themselves and join us in advocating to build more statewide support for high impact policies that will influence the entire pre-kindergarten through college pipeline for Black and Brown students. So as Maya mentioned, today's conversation will examine structural barriers to racial equity in higher education that face communities of color throughout Ohio and nationwide. Our panelists are going to discuss these high impact public policy interventions that I mentioned a moment ago, university level initiatives, and so many more ideas to improve the pre-kindergarten through college pipeline. We also want to highlight the critical role of student and alumni leadership in developing these equity-based policies. And we're joined by our student advocate that will introduce herself, and Maya will introduce her as well. So if you have any questions throughout this conversation, please drop them in the chat, and we're going to try our best to get to all of the questions. Welcome again, and we look forward to a great conversation. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, Ivan. Speaking of state public policy ideas, our first guests are coming to us from the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus to talk a little bit about how advocates, students, alumni, and the like can work with state legislatures and legislators on furthering higher education racial equity. So, Yumeno and Sean, without further ado, the floor is yours.
So sorry, I'm having trouble getting my my camera on. Oh, there we go.
Started.
Perfect.
Oh, there you go. Go ahead, Sean.
Sorry about that, everyone. Hi, so yeah, my name is Sean McCann, and I am the legislative aide to State Representative Thomas West, who, in addition to serving the 49th Ohio House District, which covers parts of Stark County, including the cities of Canton and Massillon and some surrounding townships. He also serves as the president of the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus for this General Assembly, the 134th General Assembly, as well as the following General Assembly. So yeah, really happy to be here on Representative West's behalf. He certainly sends his regrets, as does Representative Ingram. They are in a caucus meeting currently ahead of a meeting of Ohio House session. But I will go ahead and turn it over to Yumeno to introduce herself as well.
Hi, I'm Yumeno Young, and I'm the legislative aide for State Representative Catherine Ingram, who represents Ohio House District 32. It's mostly the city of Cincinnati. Representative Ingram is the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus second vice president, and she's also the ranking member on the Ohio House Higher Education and Workforce Readiness Committee, as well as a member of the Ohio House Primary and Secondary Education Committee. We're coming to you today to talk about OLBC and the work they're doing in to further racial equity in higher education. But over the past 50 years, the members of the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus, OLBC, they've been on the front lines, fully committed to fighting for issues that are important to Black people and fellow minorities here in Ohio. And at the start of this 134th General Assembly, our members all reaffirmed their pledges to fight systemic racism during this legislative session. And as this relates to education, OLBC's overall goal is to strengthen the education system to help ensure a bright future for the next generation of Black leaders here in Ohio. As I'm sure many of you are aware, our members are part of the super minority here in the Ohio legislature, and this presents extra obstacles as far as legislation, and our members have worked very hard to overcome many of those obstacles and also advocate for good policies and fight against ones that they find to be harmful. They also have made it a priority to be active in their communities. So in addition to working with local and city governments, our representatives, Rep. West and Rep. Ingram, have both hosted unemployment clinics and resource fairs, as well as a number of our other members all across Ohio. And right now, our offices are very much dealing with unemployment issues and getting people the basic needs that they need met. And those are things like housing and food security. And this conversation and webinar come at a really great time for OLBC, not today because of session and caucus, but because OLBC is actually working to set their 2021-2022 legislative priorities for this General Assembly. And they're also making further plans for collaborative events. And, you know, we definitely want to have Reason included and other partners on this call. And that's a great segue to how you all could get involved in the agenda building process here with OLBC. In order for our legislators to have the most effective and representative legislative agendas and priorities, they need to hear and learn from all of you all. The members of OLBC have years of legislative experience, and for this talk, educational experience. And however, they often look to advocates and advocacy groups like yours to see what changes can be made at the state level, what's working in other places. And we also have a team or our education leaders of OLBC are going to be Representatives Ingram, Robinson, as well as Senator Sykes, Wilson, and Mathis. And Sean could tell you a little more about how you can actually get involved in this process.
Yeah, so Representative West at the beginning of the General Assembly and at the beginning of his term as OLBC president had kind of decided that he wanted to be really intentional about empowering members of the OLBC that were interested in a particular policy area to kind of take the lead on, you know, representing OLBC with groups like Reason that might be interested in a particular policy area. So, with respect to primary, secondary, and higher education, of course, he quickly identified someone like Representative Ingram, as well as Representative Phil Robinson, who you may have just mentioned as members in the House that have taken interest in those areas, who serve as the ranking members on the respective committees. Like you may have mentioned, Representative Ingram is the ranking member on the Higher Education and Career Readiness Committee, and then Representative Robinson has for the second General Assembly now, he was chosen to be the ranking Democratic member on the Primary and Secondary Education Committee. So those two are really fantastic, leaders on the House side, and then on the Senate side, Senator Vernon Sykes and Sandra Williams are really experienced legislators who have also taken an interest in this area over their time, both in the Ohio House and now over in the Ohio Senate, as well as Senator Tina Maharath, who is also she brings a unique perspective to OLBC because she is the first Asian American state senator to serve in the Ohio Senate. So I think she brings a really important voice and an important perspective to both OLBC and to the General Assembly for a lot of students from the Asian American community, from the AAPI community that maybe have not been represented in the Ohio legislature prior to now. Certainly OLBC kind of likes that subcommittee approach, sort of, and with respect to education, those are really the legislators that are really trying to make sure OLBC is doing what it can to move the conversation forward. Like Yumeno said, just keeping in mind, obviously, our reality here in Ohio, OLBC just is trying to advocate as effectively and form an effective legislative agenda to meet the moment, to meet the tremendous need here in our state. And certainly, like you may have alluded to, that involves all of you that are on this call, the really wonderful advocates and organizations that have come forward to join the Reason Coalition and to kind of champion these issues. So with that being said, I will go ahead and kind of pivot to our third question here, which of course, you know, focusing on the downstream policies the OLBC is focusing on that can expand access and opportunity to higher education. So, you know, certainly when you look at downstream interventions and strategies, you know, we want to focus on providing equitable access to care and services to mitigate, you know, particularly I think the social determinants of health that that folks face, especially folks in communities of color in Ohio, and that's something that Rep West has focused on, that Rep Ingram has also focused on, and you know, a lot of other members. And you know, that entails things like raising the minimum wage and making sure that people have what they need to make ends meet. That entails, you know, like you may have mentioned earlier, housing security, food security, making sure that people have those needs met so that they do have that opportunity to pursue, you know, higher education, whether it's at one of our 2-year community colleges, whether it's at one of our 4-year institutions here in Ohio. We certainly have a lot of great institutions that, you know, really need more BIPOC voices to, you know, to whether it's Ohio State or whether it's some of our smaller, you know, private universities. So with all that being said, we definitely don't want to overstep our time here, but we'd be happy to take any questions at all you might have. Yumeno and I will definitely drop our contact information in the chat, and we'd be happy to, you know, we're certainly going to be touching base with our legislators after the webinar and make sure that they're kept up to date on the conversation here today. So thank you all so much for, you know, for hearing us out, and we'll be happy to connect with you afterward as well.
Yes.
Thank you, Sean and Yumeno. Sean, you mentioned meeting the moment. And I think everybody on this call recognizes that finding how we can further equity gets really granular, and we have to really understand these processes like admissions and access to figure out how we can legislate or propose policies that further equity. And so to really show us how to do that and to dig into some of those granular pieces around access is Marie Begum from Accept, who's here to share with us today. So Marie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Maya, and thanks to Reason and everyone else on the call. My name is Marie Begum. I'm the executive director and founder of Accept, which stands for Admissions Community, Cultivating Equity and Peace Today. And we're a relatively young nonprofit that focuses on removing the barriers in the path to post-secondary education, those barriers especially that impact students of color and impact students without financial means the most. And a little bit of background, I worked in college admissions for 7 years and then as a counselor at 4 different independent schools around the country for 15 years. So almost 25 years in the profession, and was able to participate in leadership of the path to college and college admissions at the highest level by serving on the board of our national organization, NACAC. And I founded this organization because I felt like we really needed someone who, or a space to focus on the racial inequities in this process, because there are so many. And very quickly, I'm coming to you from New Orleans, which is also the ancestral unceded territorial homes of the Choctaw and Homa Native peoples. And if you are still concerned, which I hope you are, about the damage from Hurricane Ida in the Gulf, know that the Native peoples were impacted the most. So thank you so much for that moment. I want to talk about college admissions and kind of some of the complexities that are involved with admissions and some of the ways forward, I think. And just acknowledging our limited amount of time, because if we had 5 days together, I couldn't sketch out for you all of the barriers. And I just want to acknowledge that this is a huge topic and there's so much to dig into. Talking about college admissions, in quotations, is a lot like talking about taxes. College admissions is Byzantine, it's opaque, it's a jargon-laden system, and it clearly benefits the wealthy and connected and those in the know. And that's just fact across every sector in this process. And just how complicated this process is makes the tax system seem almost easy. I attended a conference a few years ago, and the keynote speaker was a child development expert, child brain development expert. And she started her talk by praising college counselors for getting teenagers to do what is physically impossible for their brains. The process of looking at colleges and that whole path to post-secondary education requires executive functioning skills that teenager brains aren't physically capable of doing yet. This is really complex. And what's most frustrating to the students I worked with and families and anyone in this conversation is the most common answer that I can give to a question about admissions is, it depends, which tells you just how messed up that system can be. So a couple of things I want us, though, to keep grounded in as we talk about college admissions and that path to college. Over half of the four-year colleges in the United States enroll almost all of the students who want to go there. They're open enrollment, or they might take 80, 90% of the applicants. But we culturally, when we come to conversation about that path to college, we tend to focus on, and more than that, we tend to value the colleges that are selective and turn students away. And we tend to focus on that. So I just want to point out that that's not the norm, but also that the conversation is focused, I think, somewhat incorrectly there. And yet I'll continue to focus there. Additionally, when we talk about that selectivity and that strength and excluding people as a sign of how good it is, and we do that culturally, we do that through public policy, what I want to point out is that what we are doing is we are valuing the inputs, not the outputs. And by that, I mean, we're evaluating the strengths of the students who are coming in, their grades, their test scores, whatever metrics they have, in that way, in a data-driven way. But when we talk about the outputs, what a college does during those years with the students, we focus very broadly on two numbers: how many students made it to graduation and how long did it take them. It's important, though, to realize that when you have a high value input, you're going to have a high value output. And so these highly selective colleges, the ones that can turn students away, they're almost like doing no harm. What are they doing to improve the lives of students? That's much harder to gauge. And I think that is a challenging thing for us to wrap our heads around, but I just want to poke a little bit again that selectivity doesn't always mean better. Hard advantage does not mean better. There's some other practical points about college admissions that I think are important as we talk about this in policy terms. There tend to be two broad frameworks of how students get in a selective college. There's what's called numeric-based admissions. There's usually a rubric of grades and test scores. And there's what others call, what I've been spoke about earlier, holistic admissions. We see the student as a whole. We look at that fit. Those are the two typical frameworks. I think it's important that we find a third somehow, because there are some real pros and cons to both. Neither are even close to perfect or equitable. Another important point about admissions that's not talked about a lot is that the student's high school curriculum is a major driver in terms of selectivity. And in policy terms, we tend to talk about what's required, but we don't push that further to talk about what makes a student competitive, what makes them admissible. And we don't do that when we talk about poor students or Black and brown students, but I promise you that wealthy students, that families that are not first generation, they talk about those things and those schools know about those issues. I think that's something important for us to keep in mind. And that curriculum is especially important when we talk about STEM majors, which is where we tend to, tell students they want to go. And the final point, and this one is it is both hard to wrap your head around and extremely logical. So many of the conversations about the path to college are student-centered, and we tend to think of this process as student-centered. But the truth is that almost all decisions made in a college admissions office are driven by the institution themselves, not about the student. And we call that institutional priority. And so as an example, financial stability, having enough money to run the place, is often a key, if not the key, institutional priority. And because tuition revenue is a key driver of income and financial stability at a university, then the ability to pay, or the amount of aid a student might need, can become a major driver in the admissions process, even at the places that claim that ability to pay is not really a factor. So when we talk about reforming admissions, so much as how can we help students, but the truth is the focus needs to be on the universities and how their institutional priorities drive so much. So to transition to some of the barriers that we've identified in this process in Ohio and around the country, I specifically mentioned New Orleans, and I'm here because when I look at that metaphoric road to college, I see giant New Orleans-sized potholes. I see barriers that are insurmountable, and they are just absolutely everywhere in every part of education. The barriers to the path to college start early. They don't start in high school. They start in early education. A moment ago, I mentioned the importance of high school curriculum as a driver in the admissions process, especially if you want to study STEM. But if you want to study STEM, for example, the programs that are selective around the country, they want to see calculus. They want to see the students taking calculus when they are in high school. The ability to take calculus is often decided for a student in second or third grade when math tracking begins, well before brain development, well before they have any idea of what they may or may not want to do. And even putting aside the tracking for math and when it starts, it's important to know that almost 40% of high schools in the United States don't even offer calculus as a part of their in-school curriculum. But guess which high schools do? And guess what students tend to have access to that class more than anything? So that's just one way that a barrier to college that plays out when you're 18 starts when you're 8. Another barrier, we all talk about the cost of attending college as a major barrier, but let me tell you, the cost of applying to college is a barrier well before a student enrolls. When I was a school counselor, I would often tell families at my schools, if you're planning to apply to 7 to 10 colleges, you should budget $1,500 for the cost only of applying. That's the cost of taking a standardized test. That's the cost of sending test scores. That's the cost of sending your application and that fee. If it is a private college or a college that uses the CSS profile, then embarrassingly, it's the cost of applying for financial aid. There are some workarounds, but very few, and they're hard to get, and they're even harder to get at public institutions. So the cost of applying is an enormous barrier well before a student even gets there. This process is so complex, like I mentioned, that you need that middle person to help navigate. Someone like my former job, you need a school counselor. This is where Ohio is struggling, where we all are struggling in private schools around, or I'm sorry, public schools around the country. The recommended ratio in a public school of student to school counselor is 1 counselor per 250 students. In Ohio, the average ratio is 1 counselor per 482 students. This process is so complex that you need someone to hold your hand. How do you do that in that situation? And just to give you some context, at private schools, at independent schools, typically where you see 100% of the students attending four-year college, the typical ratio is 1 school counselor, a college counselor specifically, to 50 students. That's a huge difference. That's a huge difference in the amount of help available. Another barrier that's always out there, the financial aid process, again, not even going there. The financial aid process itself is punishing. It is punishing, it is onerous, it is ongoing. And even then, when a student and a family jumps through all of those hoops, often it will still result in gapping, which means here's the amount that we can't pay, that we can't cover, that we know you need. And that results in outsized student loans. Those are some of the really typical barriers. And again, I could go on, but I want to also highlight some of the barriers that are newish. Pandemic is going to have some ongoing echoes, I think, in the world of college admissions. It's going to carry on for decades, not just for a couple of years. Tons of colleges, almost 70% in the country now, have moved to what's called test optional policies. And a lot of folks jumped and screamed and said, great, this is about equity. Test optional policy means that, hey, you don't have to send a test score, but if you have them, we're still going to use them if you want. You might guess who benefits from that. We are concerned that the testing in general has provides so many barriers and so many challenges, but the test optional piece has muddied the waters, and our strong push and advocacy is for universities to go test free, which means no use of them at all. But even outside of the admissions process, sometimes universities will have specific programs. And again, those most selective ones, we still need test scores. Some scholarship programs still require them, including scholarships that are run by the state. I'm also very curious how 2 years of disrupted education, which has really impacted students of color and poor students the most, how this is going to play out 10 years from now. Remember, again, that importance of curriculum and math tracking. What's going to happen to these third graders currently when they are looking at college? And I think that we need to get ahead of that question. And with the loss of tuition revenue and the continued more focus on revenue as a driver, how will the long-term economic impacts of the pandemic play out in college admissions when more families are going to need more help? those are pandemic driven, but one kind of new-ish barrier that I want to draw our attention to is what I think is called the dataization of college admissions. And by that, I mean, there's an entire industry of people who've popped up who run statistical numbers and make statistical models that essentially make the decisions and set values on metrics. And that's a very small number of private companies making decisions for a huge number of colleges and college students. Something that's not really known, but something that I know folks in the Reason Project are working on and hope to bring attention. Finally, and I'm going to rush through this, the question about what are some high impact public policy, university policies that's helping. I want to point to some and I hope that you go out and research them. First, the HEOP program, HEOP in New York State, and the other two programs attached to it have opened the doors for higher ed for decades. Second, the California A through G curriculum system is a system that allows students to know exactly what programs want, and they know well before they get to college. And it's something that even middle school counselors and teachers are aware of. I'd encourage us to take a look at Michigan's statewide transfer articulation agreements that work for all two-year colleges to go to any four-year college. And I want to leave us with 4 really big ideas to chew on. First, as the Education Trust paper published last year pointed out, problems that have racialized impacts must be met with racialized solutions. And I think we fear that in higher ed, but I want to point out the importance of that. Second, I think it's extremely important in higher ed public policy for us to disaggregate Asian data. That if you pull apart the nationalities, you will see very different patterns among Asians and immigrant Asians and Asians from different parts of the world than broadly if we were lumped into 50 nations. And I think that will tell a lot about equity. Third, we need to kill this deficit thinking and move to asset thinking. These aren't students who don't have access. These are students who bring the skills to find what they need. And finally, my lifelong dream, my big dream, is that we make lifelong learning a policy and a systemic goal, that we shouldn't be talking about college admissions as only 17-year-olds, but that education continues your entire life and that the system and policies are set up so that that's possible, not something that's an aside. And with that, I thank you for your time and I look forward to the questions later. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marie. And thank you for that kind of nationwide top level view of access and admissions. And now we want to talk specifically about Ohio. What are some of the challenges? What's happening? And our resident Reason Coalition Ohio policy expert, Mr. Pete Van Leer, is going to join us and share with us. The floor is yours, Pete.
Thank you, Maya. So yeah, some of the issues that we're following very closely right now, I have to lead off with the critical race theory work, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it's, as many of you probably know from around the country, it's an effort to keep our young people from learning an honest and complete history of our country's complex, story. And there are 2 bills in Ohio that attack honesty in education, making it harder, not impossible, for schools, including at higher ed level, to center equity, for example, or address both implicit or systemic bias through training, through coursework, et cetera. So there's 2 bills, House Bills 322 and 327. 327 is very broad and applies to higher ed, and it has punitive, withholding of funding for, violations or alleged violations of this new law if it were to take effect. Secondly, I want to talk about Ohio's punitive approach to the collection of institutional student debt. That's money owed by students and former students to institutions, and also transcript withholding. The result is that all schools are required to certify their debt, submit it to the Attorney General for collection, and it really sets in process a very punitive, harsh, money-focused approach to higher ed and debt at the higher ed level. Takes us away from the understanding that higher ed is a public good. And again, it makes it very much less student-centered. And at the university and college level, there's a very broad, across the state transcript withholding for students and former students who owe money to the schools themselves. And this is not about student loan debt. It's about institutional debt. It could be parking tickets, library fines, tuition, room and board, you name it. It's just a whole array of things. And it is very, it has much more of an impact from what we can tell on Black and brown students and on part-time lower income students. Fine. Next, I want to talk about affordability. Ohio has the 9th largest affordability gap among states. It's more than $8,000 at public four-year universities, and that's calculated as the net price of a public university education minus income from working 10 hours a week. So, that includes all aid, et cetera. So this is that's a huge gap, and Ohio is one of the worst states in the country for this gap. It's also, of course, connected to funding. The state share of instruction is Ohio's primary funding mechanism for public higher ed, and it has not kept up with inflation. When adjusted, it's below 2006 levels now in 2021. The connected issue of funding and structure of the Ohio College Opportunity Grant, which is the state's main needs-based financial aid for higher ed, with both public and private. The SSI, the shared income, the shared state share of instruction is just for public schools, but this grant goes to private and public schools. And again, it's far below what it was before the 2008 recession. And right now, in 2018, the most recent year we've got data for, Ohio ranked 35th in state funded expenditures for need-based undergraduate grant dollars. $214 per undergraduate FTE. The top state, New Jersey, provided more than $1,600. So there's a big comparison, a huge gap there. We also ranked as a state 40th in grant dollars per capita for students, for Ohioans age 18 to 24, at 128 per capita. In comparison, the top state is now South Carolina, which provided nearly $900 per college age resident. OCOG is what they call a last dollar grant, so it can be applied only to tuition and general fees, and it really excludes virtually every student who attends a public community college or a four-year regional campus as opposed to main campuses. So the four-year campuses, and both public and private, as well as the for-profit career colleges, which are often very exploitative and really are debt machines for students, they're able to use OCOG because these schools are more expensive. So it's a strange thing that students attending the lower for-cost public 4 years, like Central State, Ohio's only public HBCU, get a lot less money when they apply for this grant. So, and we know that tuition and general fees, since it's a last dollar grant, they're only one part of the cost of attending college. It includes childcare, transportation, living expenses, and those just are not covered. So it really puts college, even community college, out of reach for so many people. And community colleges, regional campuses, and of course the HBCU, they enroll much higher percentage of students who are non-white, first gen, part-time, or come from families with lower incomes. So Policy Matters addresses these issues. We're a research organization, so a lot of the information I've been sharing is based on our research, both what we've done directly and what we've gathered from other sources. We communicate that with shareholders, with interested parties, stakeholders, and also the media. And a big part of what we do, and it's why I'm excited to be part of this Reason Network, is we work very closely with a lot of different partners. And a lot of times our research will drive what that advocacy is. And we do a lot of advocacy also at the state level, in the legislature, and other agencies where the decisions are being made, policies are being set. Because our goal is for Ohio to have a vibrant and sustainable economy, and it's got to be equitable and inclusive, and we can't do that without a strong public higher education system. So how can we, the ways to demonstrate this is like for the legislature to stop this anti-CRT movement, to really protect honesty in education, to review the outcomes-based funding system in the state for the state share of instruction, to make sure it's focused and centered on equity, to change the structure of OCOG so that students choosing more affordable options can actually access it, and really to get us out of this transcript trap, to change the debt process so that students don't get trapped in lower paying jobs without being able to go back to school because they're not allowed back if they owe debt, or if they can't get their transcripts. So those are both state and school level policies, but those would be the main things that we think could be changed at the state level pretty quickly with the political will, with the advocacy to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pete, for that kind of inside look on what's happening specifically in Ohio. What are some of the specific challenges in Ohio? And we've talked about kind of high level, nationwide, what are some barriers to access? We've talked about Ohio specific at the policy level, but now we want to talk about some of the experiences of students and community-based organizations who are supporting students throughout the post-secondary process. And so for that, now we will welcome to the Zoom room, Mr. Maine, who is from Esperanza Inc., to share with us about some of that on the ground work she's doing. So Jermaine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maya. Can you hear me okay? I hope so. Wonderful. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to be here with all of you today. I am the manager of post-secondary initiatives at Esperanza Inc., serving students all across the nation through leadership, college retention, mentorship, and scholarships programs. Serving Latino students and students of color for a little bit over a decade in multiple capacities, including being an admissions counselor. And I am originally from Venezuela, so that has also informed my practices. And one of the main reasons actually why I serve my community is because of my own struggles as a college student in multiple higher education institutions. But more specifically, we want to get to business. So starting with question 1 on the screen, one of the best ways that I have seen multiple institutions provide support to underrepresented communities all across our state has been through scholarships. Definitely scholarships, it's a main concept and an element in student success, in addition to freshman college retention programs. Research tells us that that first year, it's one of the most difficult for underrepresented students. Mentorship also, it's a big element, and more intentional professional development, such as requiring students to complete internships, co-ops, research, and I would suggest at least once a year to expose and connect students to their field. It's extremely important. I am pleased to mention that all those programs are embedded within our post-secondary umbrella, and I have seen firsthand our student population flourish by connecting with these multiple services and elements. Another big component that we like to emphasize and connect our students to, it's mental health resources, ensuring that they have access to mental health opportunities, resources, and individuals on and off campus who can culturally respond to their needs. It's extremely necessary. In addition to the previous mention, also providing a sense of community, understanding and creating an environment where our students feel that they belong, that they need to feel represented and also accepted by who they are. They also need to feel genuinely supported. And I have worked with multiple individuals within our college partnerships that project that. And our students can definitely identify when someone genuinely cares and supports them so that they can continue to improve whatever it's needed in their college journey so that they can move forward until the time of graduation. More importantly, I think that I would like to state that ideally a pipeline that serves to bridge the disconnect between low-income districts, deprived academic preparation system, and the rigorous academic demands from higher education institutions, specifically in the state of Ohio. I'm referring to prestigious institutions that bring the best students from all across the high schools in the nation, but fail to identify that the academic preparation, it's not the same, which provides the students with a cultural and academic shock because they are not as well prepared as their peers. The majority of my students, after struggling with the initial process, will get up to speed because they are resilient and they have our support. However, not all of them are able to succeed in their quest. In addition to that, I also have to reference and speak about an often forgotten group, which is the DACA or undocumented students, which sometimes could be mistakenly categorized within the Latino or Hispanic population only, but data indicates that more and more individuals from all across the world are under both DACA and undocumented categories. And these group essentially does not have access to financial aid at most Ohio institutions due to their status. In many occasions, our students have to pay out-of-state fees and they have to pay out of pocket. And their only way that they can make that happen is by working multiple jobs during the academic year. So we're talking about an extremely hardworking population that it's doing everything impossible and possible within their reach to ensure that they're able to obtain a college degree. We can compare that to other states such as California, Illinois, Arizona that have provided financial aid support to students who are under that category, and would be ideally, the same case for students who are here in the state of Ohio. Moving on to the next question. In regards to equity, I think that ideally, once again, I'd like to see skilled, trained, and culturally competent success coaches who can guide our students based on their individual challenges. Not all students, one size does not fit all. It's really important that an individualized approach it's taken to understand what exactly are our students, going through and struggling. And the only way that can be captured, it's through surveys, research, one-on-one interactions from the, as Mary mentioned earlier, intentionality and what's actually in the priority list of these higher education institutions. So that would be definitely ideally. In addition to that, students have a hard time identifying the root of the problem. So sometimes they might feel like they are failing a class. And in many occasions, I've had conversations with students who think that it's the end for them. If they're not able to do well in a class, that means that they're not cut out for college. And if they do not have a conversation with us, they will drop out of school. I've seen that multiple times. And it is important to understand that, through these conversations, we're able to let the students know you're not the first one. It's part of the process. You're getting acclimated to the system, to something that's completely new. You just need to be able to access the multiple resources that have been implemented for your success. And because many of them do not know where those are or what those are, they cannot even identify what the root of the problem is. Having someone who can guide them through the process, especially during those first 2 years of college, it's extremely instrumental. Moving on to our next question. I would say that definitely one of the most helpful, and I'm almost done, one of the most helpful policies that I have seen has supported our students is the Ohio College Opportunity Grant, because that has definitely covered the gap for many students who need to have an additional financial support to continue progressing through their college career, especially when taking remedial classes has prevented them from obtaining a FAFSA during a year because they maxed out on it. Finally, I think that something that's very important and that I really want to, a point that I really want to get across, it's that any institution, in order to connect with students of color, it's really important that you have a sincere intentionality in creating pipelines that go beyond, we want you at our school, we want to work with you, but to effectively recruit students who have an opportunity to get rooted on their campus community by providing family support systems, Q&As, and individuals who actually speak the languages that they may not, that might not be just English. I will stop there and look forward to the questions later, but I definitely love the conversation. I would love to continue. Thank you.
This is fabulous, Jermaine. And we have some more questions based off the things that you just said, all the insight you just gave us. And so zooming down even further, Jermaine works with students across Ohio and across the nation through their post-secondary transition. But now we want to talk to students, the real experts here. And so we have our own student advocate from the Reason Coalition, Anu, who's going to join us now. So the floor is yours, Anu.
Thank you, Maya. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Anaghavala Makani, or Anu. My pronouns are they, she, and I'm a senior majoring in economics at The Ohio State University. I'm also the student advocate for the Reason Coalition of Ohio. So in this role, I serve as the liaison between the university, the student body, and the coalition. As noted by my position as a student advocate on the Reason Coalition, student voice is extremely crucial for the Reason Project and for education policy making in general, because the people with the most insight on the student experience and the intended effect of equity policy versus their actual effect are in fact students. By centering students, we're able to gain insight into the nuances of the student experience and insight into these tricky corners of campus to understand, like campus culture in and outside the classroom, in organizations, in living spaces, and other college activities. When these experiences of students are better understood, we're better equipped to craft effective policy to support them. As I've explained, it's really important to emphasize student voices, and especially BIPOC student voices, since they're usually the ones not heard as often. And from experience, it can be really difficult to feel heard for BIPOC students at large, predominantly at white institutions. Some characteristics of a more equitable campus would include a lot of things and touch all parts of campus, ranging from academics to mental health to representation on campus. More specifically, an equitable campus would prioritize recruiting and retaining Black, Brown, and Indigenous professors and professionals on campus, and knowing their importance and impact on the BIPOC student experience. An equitable campus would organize and triage student supports, whether they be academic support, physical and mental health support, or access to basic necessities like housing and food. These points I just mentioned can easily apply to how universities can demonstrate their commitment, especially since it's very hard and it's very on brand for large flagships to form new task forces every time the BIPOC communities on campus speak up about inequity or injustice. I would say that the first step to showing commitment to diversity is taking student concerns and demands to heart, and actually listening to what changes these students want to see in the university, governments, and campus life. In my experience, the experience of many students and the experience of many students that I have connected with through Reason, universities hold meetings with BIPOC students, most notably when tensions are high, but rarely do these conversations lead to tangible differences, and students leave feeling less empowered to advocate for themselves. And I also want to really point out that these meetings are usually well publicized, and they're usually when tensions are most high. However, much of the organizing around diversity, equity, and inclusion have been done by the students themselves. So I think the first steps that students and universities can take together are that universities should demonstrate being serious about their commitment to these values, and they can actually take into account what students are actually wanting the university to do. And it can really, really help to show, because students don't really want a university, they don't want to be a part of an institution that doesn't listen to them. And through this, centering those student voices, universities should really learn to recognize the value of student contributions and work with students and work with us to implement these changes. Through the Reason Project, we want to work with the institutions to help them demonstrate the commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion that I just spoke about a couple points ago. As I mentioned, the Reason Coalition centers student and alumni voice and perspective. Currently, on campus at Ohio State, I'm convening student leaders from across my campus to better understand their student experiences and directly involve them in the policy proposal work of the broader Reason Coalition. In fact, I'm currently leading students that are crafting their own recommendations to the university, and more student organizations are joining the Reason Coalition Ohio's efforts daily. I'm grateful for all the informative conversations and the passion within OSU orgs to work towards a more equitable and more inclusive atmosphere for the students. Thank you.
Thank you, Anu. We have so much to learn from you, clearly. So folks, Anu just kind of spoke about what an equitable campus would look like. So we want to hear from you. In the chat, drop what you think an equitable Ohio higher ed system would look like. What would be some of the characteristics? And if you're not up from Ohio, that's okay. Drop in the chat in your state, what would be some of the characteristics of a more racial equity focused higher ed system. So we want to hear from you. And we also want to hear from all of our panelists. It's time for our kind of roundtable Q&A. So if my panelists can hop online and we'll get started. And Pete, I'll direct the first question at you. We're speaking about all of these challenges in higher ed, and you spoke about some of the challenges in Ohio specifically. Could you talk a little bit about what the state will look like in the next 10, 20, 30 years if some of these challenges that we spoke of go unnoticed or unaddressed?
Sure. So, Ohio has a goal that 65% of all Ohioans aged 25 to 64 would have a degree, credential, or certificate of value in the workplace by 2025. So we're, right now, the most recent data show that we're 50%. So if you put, what we know about who has access to higher ed right now, and, whether it's the flagship at OSU or other schools, and, everything we've heard from other panelists, we know that Black and brown students are still underrepresented in that, even that falling short of that goal. So we also know that, to get a job that pays a living wage and increasingly requires some level of education beyond high school. And our state just isn't providing the funding, providing the support, whether it's at the state level in terms of funding, support at universities and colleges to really get students, to make sure students can persist through all the challenges that face them, whether, whatever their challenges might be. So we're going to continue to have an undereducated population in our state. We're not going to have a strong, vibrant economy, and it won't be inclusive. We won't be able to include all of Ohioans who haven't been served well by the current systems, and low-income Ohioans, people will be increasingly left behind. And I think what we know, what's clear is that if you leave some people behind, the economy won't be working for everybody as well as it could.
Thank you, Pete. And you spoke specifically about Black and brown students not being represented. And a lot of the work that the Reason Coalition does when speaking to folks, we hear them say that, well, Black and brown students, largely aren't college ready. That's why, they're struggling to be enrolled at these institutions. And so Marie, I want to kick it to you to talk a little bit about what does that mean? What do we mean when we say college ready? What are those metrics? And I think they may be a little flawed and we may need to change our thinking. So can you share with our guests a little bit about that?
Thanks. College ready and college readiness is such fraught terms. And in public policy, the phrase college ready tends to be a metric that is defined by either the ACT or the SAT, often depending on how many students take the test in the state, or if that test is one of the graduation requirements. So how do they decide, and how do they decide what's considered college ready? But more importantly, why do they get to decide what is considered college ready? And so for example, in the ACT, there are several sections of the test: reading, math, science, which is more like chart reading. And what ACT says to a state is, there's thresholds at different scores that say this score predicts that a student could get a B or better, a C or better, or might predict the student might get below a C. Keep in mind, they're not talking about specific classes. They're talking about extremely broad academic brushstrokes with this, right? But is the purpose of college to have students only who get Bs or Cs? Is that the threshold that we're using for other students as well? And again, what is actually going into that metric? And so just from a public policy realm, when we talk about that phrase college ready, I want to point out that it's not as it's more defined and there are more specific boundaries around it. But when you dig into it, it's really questionable. And none of that even touches the racist and sexist biases that are just fraught in standardized testing to begin with. So there's a lot that goes into it. But one idea that we've chewed on in this project and in other spaces is finding a way to redefine and reclaim that idea and that definition of college readiness on a public policy level and wresting it back from testing agencies.
Yeah. And Jermaine, you spoke about some of your specific experiences with students and their families earlier. Do you have experience of these kind of rigid college ready metrics hindering or even misrepresenting the abilities of students? And could you share a little bit about that with us?
Absolutely. I have a student who Esperanza has served since he was, I believe, his freshman year in high school. Due to family challenges and many other underlying factors, he did very poorly academically all through high school, let alone, you know, on the ACT or SAT test as well. So life, you know, changed him, or I would probably identify him as making a decision for his own and changing things around. And he's about to graduate next May with his bachelor's in criminal justice, despite his family, you know, situations with the criminal system specifically. And that is just a perfect example to indicate that it's not, like Marie was saying, the determinator of whether a student will be successful or not. Many other underlying factors will definitely impact that success. And I would specifically say that the amount of support a student receives during their academic years will more than anything determine that.
Thank you, Jermaine. And Yumeno and Sean, I want to kick it to you next to talk about, these advocates have shared some really great expertise about access, about completion and what students are needing. And you guys listed in your first session kind of how advocates can work with lawmakers to address some of these issues. Could you talk a little bit about that again, how advocates can get involved with agenda setting and legislating around these ideas that we've spoken about?
Yeah, so for one thing, I think Policy Matters does do a lot of great work that I think advocates could look to as far as how they present the information to our representatives. We've gotten policy briefs. They often write testimony. You all as a coalition are able to submit joint letters and things like that, and especially using our key points of the OLBC members that would happily be disseminated amongst the members of the General Assembly. Furthermore, you know, Anu, I'm so appreciative we've gotten to meet with you now a few times. And I think she emphasizes in a great way that we want to hear from students, and she's bringing the voice of students of color to the State House. She already has, and as well as being enabled by Reason and Maya and Ivanly. And, you know, we want to set up meetings. We'll set up meetings, bring your policy, your research, your what you want to see from our representatives. And they're more than happy to discuss how that could look in Ohio, where they could see it going. Like I said, they have years of experience. Rep. Ingram served 20 years on the Ohio School Board or Cincinnati School Boards, as well as she's currently on the OTA, like College 529 Investment Board member. So she has a lot of knowledge on those things. So she would love to just discuss those things with you. And like Sean can mention, or we have talked about before, those members inform OLBC, they inform Representative West, and then Rep West can take it from there.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry, Maya, you're about to jump in.
No, the floor is yours, Sean. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think Yumeno hit the nail on the head. Really, just oftentimes, I think because legislators have, they serve on 4 or 5 different committees, and maybe they're working on several bills of their own. I think what they really appreciate, though, just a mini request to talk about an issue in further detail, and if folks have legislative ideas that have worked well in other states that maybe they could bring to the table here in Ohio. I think he gets a lot of his best ideas, for bills that he ends up introducing from people that are doing the work, like obviously so many of you all, and from some of his constituents back home who are involved in their on the Canton or Massillon school board, or who teach in those schools. He leans on people that are living this every day to tell them, hey, like this is a bill you might want to look at introducing, or this is a bill that, like Yumeno said, maybe Rep West doesn't feel like he has the capacity or the bandwidth, but another member of the OLBC or another member of the caucus, more broadly speaking, of the House Democratic Caucus, might be interested in taking up this or that piece of legislation. So really, he is always open to meeting with folks and kind of being that conduit for getting a bill rolling, getting a legislative concept rolling, and whether it's him taking it on or whether it's a different member taking it on. I think they really, we kind of touched on this before, they're just really always looking for new ideas, and obviously there's just a tremendous wealth of knowledge on this call right now. People that have brought so much good information and lived experience to the table that I think could be translated into bill ideas for Rep West and Rep Ingram, and for other members of the OLBC to kind of move the conversation forward in Ohio, because that's definitely an area, as we kind of look at the bills our members have introduced, that's an area that they could really, higher ed particularly, we haven't seen the legislature do too much on this General Assembly or even the prior. So they're always open to new ideas.
Great, and we have a lot of advocates who want to get involved in those processes. So thank you, Sean. And Marie, I'm going to kick it back to you to ask about accountability. That's an iffy word, we don't like it, right? But let's take a deep breath and talk about it. How can universities hold themselves accountable to these values that we've talked about? Equitable access to resources for completion for Black and Brown students. And then how can advocates hold institutions accountable, or work with institutions to hold them accountable around these things?
Sure. I think that's a question that comes up a lot because of the perception of constraints as defined by the Supreme Court. So I think a lot of times, those of us who talk about this, when we talk with folks about what representation means, immediately the question begins, well, how do we do that? We're not allowed to have quotas. How do we do that? Some states aren't allowed to talk about, gather that data. I think that's actually taking quite the opposite approach that we should have ever taken in the first place. This is not about a specific number count. That assumes that there is then enough, right? I think Anu said this, and I'm going to say this again and again and again, and just back her up with this and all the other students. True accountability comes from the students, comes from the people there. It's not me as a policy person or an advocate. It's not those of us on the outside trying to measure things, when we know that the lived experience and the voices and their experience, that's the accountability. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's how we know they're doing the work or not. And so I want us to get us away almost from that reliance on metrics, because that brings them the fear of, ooh, metrics means we're going to have a quota and it means Supreme Court's going to be a thing. Let's just get away from that entirely and center the student voice and the student experience 100% in that accountability.
Speaking of, Jermaine, I want to hop to you to talk about institutions and partnerships with community-based organizations. So how can institutions, thinking about accountability and having some partners in that accountability, how can institutions expand access and opportunity and completion rates for communities of color through innovative partnerships with community-based organizations like yours? In a dream world, how would you kind of expand some of the partnerships that Esperanza is already involved in right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So we currently have multiple partnerships. And before I get into that conversation, I just yesterday had a session with our students and I was telling them how in many occasions we have a lot of corporations, individuals, institutions, overall come into Esperanza to meet a quota of I've made an outreach for diversity. And that it's just that initial, contact, conversation, planning stages, but nothing follows through because it's just a matter of I am doing something and I am, reporting that on paper. Unfortunately, we've had to deal with a lot of that. And I say it's very unfortunate because when we're talking about priorities, when we're talking about change and intentionality, it takes a lot. It takes commitment to, in essence, follow through and implement something that's going to benefit the student population, which ultimately at the end also benefits the institution overall, in essence. Specifically to the partnerships that we currently have with organizations or institutions like Keys Western Reserve, we have one of our programs there where Esperanza co-facilitates with a leader on campus, and that model comes from Unidos US, which is a Latino national organization that provided the curriculum to us, and that has the same model with multiple institutions all across the nation. Seeing and being intentional, in connecting our students, which is the core of the program, retaining students in their college academic campuses and ensuring that they're connecting with the multiple resources on campus so that they have the information to navigate through their college experience. I have seen, and I can testify on the impact and the difference it makes on students who go through the program versus other students within our population that do not. So.
Thank you, Jermaine. And we are coming up against time, which I'm so sad about because I have so many questions for all of you. However, before we wrap up, I want to leave space for each of our panelists to, one, share how folks can get in contact with them or get involved in work that they're doing, and to share any final remarks that you all would like to share. So we'll go in the order that we had our talks today. So we'll start with Yumeno and Sean and then kick it to Marie.
Sorry, Yumeno. I don't think I have anything further to add. I don't know about you, but we can definitely re-up our contact information. And like we said earlier, definitely more than happy to get anyone who wants to meet with Representative West, with Representative Ingram, with the OLBC at large. We're more than happy to get you all connected and get them, get you in front of them and just talk about any legislative ideas, anything they can do to be helpful. Not just as OLBC, but as individual members in their communities.
Yes, like Sean said, we could drop our contact information again. And if you want to set up a meeting with Rep. Ingram or Rep. West, feel free to reach out. I really appreciate being able to get to hear from all of our panelists today and I hope that our listeners also come forth with ideas, and I can't wait to work with all of you.
I'll put my contact info into the chat. But you can also find Accept on any of the social medias. Just check out Accept. And I think my closing thought is that just for all of us to remember that this process of applying to college, of going, of getting in, of getting money for it, all of this was designed. We have just as many opportunities to redesign it, to completely dismantle it, and to build something that's equitable and that works so much better. So just remember, we we can do way better than we can, but we also have the power to do that. And thank you for this, and thanks for joining us.
So yeah, I would just say that we have to do this together, right? The broader coalitions, the more people can work together, that's how change is going to happen, and especially in a state like Ohio, and issues are so related to each other. You know, one example is K-12 funding this past year in Ohio. Because of a lot of advocacy across a lot of different stakeholders and individuals, they got in place the Fair Schools Funding Plan, which is not by any means perfect, but it's better than what they had before, and it's a step in the right direction. So I would love to see that kind of advocacy, you know, joint advocacy, shared work on the issues that we're talking about here today. And I'll also put my contact in the chat. Thanks to everybody.
Echoing, you know, everything that's been shared so far, it's been an honor. Thank you, Maya and Ivan Lee, the Reason Coalition, for the opportunity. To all the panelists, it's been an honor to share the floor with you, the electronic or virtual floor. And I look forward to continuing the conversation so that we can continue making an impact in the lives of our students so that they can do whatever it is that they want to ensure that they can reach their goals and have success.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been an honor. It was really amazing to listen to all of you today, virtually, of course. I just want to emphasize again and again that as important as it is for equitable practices to come into higher education, it's also important to retain those equitable practices in higher education. So if anyone would like to discuss how we can get through to those equitable practices, especially on college campuses, I will also drop my contact info in the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all the listeners. Yeah, have a great afternoon.
That's all right. I couldn't have said it better than that. So a great big thank you and hand clap to all of our panelists who joined, and a great big thank you to all of you who joined the conversation today. We look forward to working together with you. Please follow up on all things Reason Coalition. We look forward to working with all of the partners that are in the Zoom room today. So thank you for joining us and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye, everybody.